What if climate change isn't just an environmental crisis, but the force redefining how we think about progress itself? As floods, droughts, displacement, migration reshape our world, climate has become more than a policy challenge. Is it becoming the new compass for guiding global policies and development? Join us on the Global Development Review as we explore this question with Dr. Tabea Lissner, Director of Climate Change at the Robert Bosch Foundation in Berlin, and Anila Noor, refugee activist and the founder of New Women Connector in The Hague, Netherlands. Welcome to the Global Development Review, where we unpack the big questions shaping our shared future. I'm your host, Jaffer Latief Najar, and in this episode, we are asking, is climate the new compass for global development policy? As the impacts of climate change deepen, from rising sea levels to forced displacement and shifting economic priorities, the development agenda is being redefined. No longer can we think of progress only in terms of growth or poverty reduction. The challenge before us is how to build resilience, equity, and cooperation in a world shaped by environmental limits and social interdependence. To help us explore this shift, we are joined by two distinguished guests whose work captures the global and human dimensions of this transformation. Our first guest, Dr. Tabea Lissner, is the Director for the Climate Change at the Robert Bosch Foundation in Germany. With a background in geography and over 15 years of experience working at the interface of science and policy, including at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research and Climate Analytics as co-lead, Tabea has been a leading voice in bridging the gaps between global climate models and the very real context-specific adaptations need of vulnerable communities. She was a lead author of IPCC 6th Assessment Report, contributing to the chapter on water and the summary of policymakers. Her work focuses on understanding both the limits and opportunities of climate adaptation and how inclusive transformative solutions can emerge when we connect local realities with global strategies. Joining her is Anila Noor, a refugee activist based in the Netherlands. Anila brings a powerful perspective from the front lines of migration, identity, and inclusion. She is the founder of New Women Connectors, a movement amplifying the voices of migrant and refugee women across Europe and advocating for inclusion, not just integration, as a cornerstone of policy. Her advocacy is rooted in personal experiences and a deep commitment to transforming the refugee narrative from one of the vulnerability to one of agency and contribution. Together, Dr. Tabea Lissner and Anila Noor will help us explore whether climate can or should become the guiding compass for global development. Can climate action drive a more just and connected world? Or might it risk reinforcing old hierarchies in new ways? Stay with us as we dive into these questions and more, right here on Global Development Review. Dear Tabea and dear Anila, thank you very much for joining Global Development Review podcast and welcome to our episode of this. It's a very relevant episode given the current concentration on the issue of climate change. So I will just start with Dr. Tabea. Your contribution is immense on this issue, and I really would like to gain insight from your own experience of working on climate and development. And I'm just wondering what lessons or insights have shaped your perspective on how climate is reshaping the global development policy.
Yeah, thanks a lot. And of course, this can be a very, very big question with a very long answer. But maybe just to share a few, a few pieces of my background and also some reflections. So I started out in this field more from a science perspective and worked a lot on assessing vulnerability. And one thing that really struck me while I was working or when I started out on my PhD was really how limited the measurement perspective was on a lot of the global models that are really essential, of course, also for climate policy, because we're looking so much into the future. Of course, the modeling environment is absolutely essential. the kind of societal goalposts of where we actually want to go are very, very limited. But of course, the question around climate and development really requires also to really think about all of the different dimensions that are relevant to development, but also to our societies, from more physical questions like food security and water access, but of course also healthcare, or also social questions like social cohesion. And a lot of the climate modeling that is so decisive for climate policy wasn't really including that. So that's kind of where I personally started out on my journey, if you will, on climate and development. And after that more scientific look at things, I was fortunate to work with Climate Analytics, an organization that focuses very much on working with small island states and least developed countries in the international climate negotiations, and worked a lot on questions around adaptation and loss and damage in this international climate context. And that would really shaped a lot of my perspective and on the questions that you just raised. And I think what's really important around this question is really to recognize how closely interlinked questions around climate and development really are, and that one cannot really be successful without the other. Any investment in development outcomes can only have a long-term positive effect if we really consider the outlook of where we might be going in the next few years. But also on the climate side, there's, I think, a current discussion also somewhat bubbling up around the question around adaptation or mitigation. And I think it's absolutely essential to realize that the interlinkages there are absolutely essential. We can only adapt and have positive development outcomes if we really urgently limit temperatures, but do that in a sustainable way that really considers these other aspects as well. So I think that to me is really, really one essential thing that I really realized over the last few years, and really hope to also anchor very much in my work going forward.
Anila, you have been working on the issue of women rights, migration, refugees, and inclusion. I just want to understand how it has shaped your view on the intersection between climate and human mobility, especially when it comes to refugee rights and women rights, migrant women rights.
Thank you so much, Jaffer, for this question. I think advocating for inclusive policies when it's come to with the lens of intersectional lens, bringing the gender perspective and intersectionality in the migration and forced migration, we figured it out. It's so interlinked because without climate adaptation or climate just transition or climate implementation can't be sustainable if we are not talking about gender justice to climate justice. If I give you example, being from last 3 years, being involved, especially the climate global gathering like COP, we figured it out, and we saw how displaced communities, especially refugee women voices been, I will say, very invisible. And gender lens is already invisible, and refugee communities, they are on the edge of vulnerabilities because of this distance, and they are unfortunately more on the forefront. So it's so ironic, like on the global domain, when we are discussing about the solution, these voices are like displaced communities, especially women, they are not there, and they are the one on the edge to bear all the effect of the climate disaster. So that's what we are trying to do, to advocate. In our recent work, we just launched this year again, but it's based on our coffee tables, which we are running from last 3 years. So coffee means co-designing with the feminist lens to bring this discussion to simplify the policy discussion for the communities. So communities, especially women living in different domain in the global south, in Bangladesh, in Kenya, even in Europe, we are simplifying the discussion. What green energy, what is EU climate deal, how we are bringing this knowledge. And again, we are also advocating and giving this training to the policymakers so they can understand how to engage with the community. So it's very complex because our life as a displaced person or person on the move is complex. So that's what we are doing, and we are really trying to see how we can bridge the new knowledges so they can take their knowledges as a leading knowledge and to show their resilience. We really want to simplify the climate debate, and we really want to evaluate how this discussion is still today is discussing without having the seat on the table from the representation of the community. So we are asking not only for the have a seat on the table, but asking more meaningfully being engaged to create a more sustainable environment.
Tabea, I just would like to carry forward from Anila's point on resilience and also the involvement of communities. There were traditional goals of development in global development issues like eradicating economic poverty and other economic growth. Focus on economic growth, but do we see like the climate crisis is changing the traditional goal of global development? Is the tide shifting towards the focus of global development issues in alliance with the agenda of the climate change or climate crisis? And how we can also look into the issue of engagement of communities and the broader approach centered on resilience and the natural limits of planet.
And so I think it has many different dimensions, and I think in some areas and for some actors we can certainly already see the shift that climate is taking much more space in the development debate, but of course that could be very much even more. But I think a lot of the points that Anila raised actually are very important, also around all of the different aspects in the climate and development debate, and also for us at Robert Bosch Stiftung are really central to the program that we really see, where really making sure that the voices of those that are at the front lines of climate change that are really affected by climate itself, but also by the decisions around climate policy, really need to be heard across different levels, because decisions that are made, for example, in the COP context, so in the context of the international climate negotiations, they very much affect local communities on the ground as well, and really determine whether they, for example, in a land use context, really are enabled and have the resources, but also the choices around the governance of their land, whether they can actually respond to the climate crisis and be resilient and adapt, for example, on the ground. So really looking at these different layers of decision making, how they interact, is absolutely essential. And I think that is, to a certain extent, becoming an important element in the climate and development debate, but certainly should be much more front and center to enable local communities to be much more central to these decisions.
Also, it also brings me to the question of power and policy. I'm just wondering, how can global institutions ensure that climate actions does not reinforce existing inequalities? Because we have seen there is a big development discourse which is also reproducing kind of inequalities to some extent.
Maybe starting again from the global level, I think a lot of the discussions in the international climate negotiations have really revolved around these questions of dynamics, and I think some steps towards kind of reflecting this risk distributions have been taken by, for example, establishing finally a loss and damage fund that really wants to respond to some of these aspects, even though, of course, it falls woefully short of what would actually be needed in there in terms of resources. There's a big discussion around the global goal on adaptation that will be very central to the negotiations in the next 2 weeks in Belém, actually. And that really wants to anchor much more also the efforts around adaptation and show also the risk gap, if you will. But again, there a huge question is, of course, at the global level, the financing question. But if we break this down, this kind of then comes again in a situation where resources are becoming increasingly scarce for development questions, but continue to be too little for adaptation. And while this, of course, also continues to raise questions around power in terms of finances and how these are distributed. And it's ever more essential, I think, to really focus these efforts that we can around adaptation, around capacity building, to really support communities to be able to, well, as we said before, right, to have a voice in those decisions and really focus on capacity building that puts them much more in a position to advocate, but also implement themselves. That can obviously only be one small piece of shifting power dynamics, and it is not just yet part of the climate debate, but really needs to be part of a broader agenda of how we think around multilateral processes and how we can make sure that voices are reflected in these different forums, recognizing that this is currently a difficult phase. But I think the climate and development lens can be a starting point where, if we really recognize this local level empowerment, can be a first step towards shifting those power structures.
Anita, I also would like to understand from your perspective, like being a community member and working for the cause of refugee communities. So how do you see this kind of inequalities and the power dynamics in relation to climate policies?
Well, Jaffer, as I said earlier, the work which we are doing to bring the systematic justice in the policy domain, we see there's not only inequalities, but so much power dynamic is so bigger than us, and we feel so much left out. Like everyone is talking about us without us. So that's why we are advocating for meaningful participation, because meaningful participation is the main approach we are using from last few years, where we are advocating how and why meaningful participation can be a method, a tool, a approach which can help us to achieve the understanding how these communities been left out, and how we can not only involve them to share their stories, to listen to their story, to have the consultation, but have a proper partnership with them. So we can also leverage the policy till today is just taking communities, especially displaced communities, as a beneficiary. So we are advocating how we don't be present only as a case studies, as a data, but we want to be co-design this structure. If I give you the example, our recent work, as I mentioned, Together We Lead, Together We Nurture our Europe and Future, it has a multiple layers where we are talking about how we can co-design our discussion, co-design even the power of define what is a problem according to us. So we could be involved defining the problem, what is a problem according to us, and then we can pull together all the ingredients, what the resources we need to make a more sustainable solution, to implement solution. And why we even say, when we're talking about the Europe, like, because if these inequalities are happening in Europe, you can imagine how bigger it is in the global South. If it is happening, this discrimination, racism, and this inequality, if it's happening in Europe, so it's way too deeper than other countries, other regions, other local level for the displaced community, like in Bangladesh, like in Nairobi, in Uganda, in Turkey, in Lebanon. So how we can bring these equalities to understand the need of the communities. And it's very important to raise the awareness and to create a solidarity, not to take these communities only as a vulnerable community, but also celebrate their resilience, their knowledge, and give them proper resources so they can leverage their leadership and amplify the work they want to bring to for their future.
The issue of climate is not an isolated one, right? So it affects the global north, it affects the global south, it reflects people from all walks of life. It also touches like social policies, migration, development issues. I mean, heat waves in Europe is recently, especially in Netherlands, over the last few years, heat waves are becoming a very big issue. What I see is also like, I mean, climate issues, while it touches every sector and every person in some context, yet the policies remain separated. I mean, there is a separate environmental policy, there is separate policy for refugees, migrations. So it seems like they are not interconnected. There is some kind of a disconnection in it. So I mean, Tabea, you have so much experience in the field. You are expert and have immensely contributed in this. So I just want to learn from you, like, what approaches could help create more connected or interconnected are climate-informed policy making?
Yeah, so I think from a climate perspective, what always strikes me is that by saying it's climate protection or it's about the climate, we focus very much on the climate part, where in the end, climate policy, what it wants to achieve is very much for us to continue to have a livable planet, and to ensure that we safeguard the conditions that we as humans thrive under. So in the end, and this is determined through all of the different things that we value and that we need. So, and I think it's really worth kind of shifting that narrative also to really realize it's about what we value and what we want to live in, and not about the climate as such. But I think one important approach in that is really to think also through the important sectoral policies that we have. So, for example, agriculture is a huge contributor to a lot of the things that we value, right? It's about food security, obviously, but it's also about landscapes, about livelihoods, about community structures that evolve around agriculture. And it's a huge contributor, on the one hand, to the climate crisis, where around a third of emissions come from the agricultural sector. But of course, it's also hugely impacted by climate. But really, approaching a huge sector like agriculture from a more integrated perspective, I think can really provide a lot of levers for more integrated policy that really allows for thinking about the values that we have as society, and really then creates policies that are beneficial around this. And of course, the agricultural sector and land use is a huge question around this, but there's also other aspects, other sectors like the water sector, for example. Water availability is a similarly cross-cutting question, where we know very much that this is what we value. But another aspect that for us in our work is also very important is really to see also synergies between different policy areas. So I spoke before about the international climate negotiations, but of course there's other international treaties as well that kind of run in parallel and might not be as visible, but still a lot of the goals, a lot of the outcomes are very much aligned. So finding synergies there, ensuring that what we anchor in those international treaties that then are relevant to the local level, that these are synergetic and don't create additional burdens, is one important aspect. And then finally, since your initial question was very broad, also including questions around migration, social policy, this of course is absolutely essential, in particular when we work with communities on the ground that actually have to deal with all of the different pressures at once, that we really ensure that we empower those actors that see a lot of the interconnections, because in the end, resilience, like really building that on the ground, also with a forward looking lens to ensure that this is actually lasting and that it enables the communities to thrive. It's absolutely essential to see the interconnections between these processes that often are very interdependent, as Amina also pointed out.
Just like out of curiosity, and also like for the benefit of my audience, I'm just wondering like how your organization Boshi Foundation is working on this issue. Like what kind of projects are you involved into it?
So we have a huge diversity of partnerships. One very important aspect for us is really to work with communities on the ground and empower our partners in a very partnership oriented approach. In a lot of cases, really work locally anchored, work locally led, to ensure that really the priorities of the communities on the ground are being brought to the fore and are enabled to work with their issues on the long run, and really be empowered to develop along their priorities.
Anila, just coming to you, we are also seeing recently that there is a rise of climate-related migration and displacement and issues. It is now also seen as framed as a problem rather than a form of adaptation to climate change. I mean, you're working displaced population and communities. So, how can policies recognize this displaced population? And as you said, that you need to be on the table to frame the policies for you, rather than someone is framing policies for the community. So how it could be possible? I mean, what are your thoughts on it?
Well, Jaffer, to answer your question, I will say we need to understand the different dynamic. When it's come to migration, there's already very complexity entitled with that. We have a forced displacement, we have migrant communities, we have IDPs, we have stateless people. So migration has multiple reason of migration, right? And now these already been used, unfortunately, not in a very good terms. Migration is becoming so huge, and a new kind of debate to use. I mean, not so new, but still is being used as a new threat to hold migration in different part. So it's already very complex, but now we have a climate ticking like a bomb, like everyone. As you said, Netherlands is below as a water level, so we become a refugee in future if we have this disparity of the climate change. So new climate migration is happening. It was happening, but we need to understand when we are talking about the migration, how we can normalize it. Till today, migration is not being taken as a normalization. It's becoming who has the right. Like if people from the developed countries or privileged, they've been taken as experts, so they have more rights, they have no more privilege. But unfortunately, today, because of conflict, because of other reasons, people move and they will move. And migration is not being taken as a normalization. On the name of security, we see European policies are getting more and more strict. So for us, it's very important we talk about human rights. We talk about, especially when we are talking about the development sector, how we can talk about the basic human rights. So people have the right to move, right to even have their rights, and how they feel safe. And when it's come to a woman, when it's come to children, when it's come to elderly people, we really need to make sure we are giving them more facility instead of making them more vulnerabilities or exposure to the exploitation. So I don't have an answer for your question, but I think this is a very element how we take normalization of migration. It will be more. People move, people will move more and more, and climate is already there. People who are living in, for instance, in Bangladesh, I have been working there with the different refugee communities, and actually today I'm also traveling to Kenya. We hear from the refugee women who are there multiple times they are replacing because their displacement is becoming because of the climate. If they have the camp, and because the floods comes, or they don't have safe water, or they don't have other food, and they have to be replaced again, they have to displace again. So this multiple level of displacement happening multiple times for these already displaced communities.
Tabea, I will just come back to your point. You were talking about finances and how we should mobilize our resources. So if the climate becomes the guiding compass for development or issues of social justice, I mean, and it is already taking some central stage as well, what forms of international, local, and financial, cooperation or collaborations are needed, and or these current frameworks, which like multilateral fundings to regional governance to local community-based approaches, are ready to finish this climate-focused world or whatever crisis we're having.
Yeah, so obviously there's many different layers, I think, to this debate. And one very essential thing, of course, is that we urgently need to scale up financing also from the global level, so that the overall volume is simply a lot more, because there's just a lot of responsibility from high emitting countries also historically to really shoulder the burden, if you will, of all of that is needed. But it's not just about the volume; it's also, of course, how it's dispersed. And there's just a number, I think, of different avenues where it's really difficult for those most affected to really access finance in the same way, or in the way that would be needed. So I think one important aspect besides the global funding through existing streams, I think, would also be the opportunity for developing country, global south countries to really also and have different so currently the interest rates are really, really high for loans, right? Really bringing countries into increasing debt, having to debt service, and all of these vicious cycles that we do know about, where of course a lot of the investments that would be needed for building resilience on the ground would really require access to financing that doesn't increase that debt spiral. So I think that is one important aspect, but also in terms of the donor landscape, I think really empowering local communities, as I said before, through local financing, through access to really be able to implement their own priorities would be an essential component as well. But of course, it's not just about the financial resources themselves, but also about the broader, I think, the kind of rules and regulation scape, if you will, to really empower at the local level to really build resilience, invest in adaptation, but also develop in ways that would already be climate neutral and ensure that whatever development takes place on the ground is really also based on these climate resilience principles.
I'm just wondering, like, why you think it remains so difficult for grassroots organizations or community-based organizations to be recognized at par or as an equal partner in shaping climate and gender justice agendas, despite they have, a wealth of lived experiences and local connections.
Well, Jaffa, as you know, inequalities and distribution of resources are not equal, and it's not new. It's happening from centuries. We can't ignore the element of colonization. We can't ignore the element of capitalized world, and patriarchy is also there. So it's interlinked. So when we are talking about, allocation of the funds, and also a recent funding card shows how an NGOs or community-based organization and a refugee-led organization like us is getting more impact because of this funding, because we don't have resources and neither power. So this is making us more vulnerable. And that's why I'm saying we feel like we are being dependency of the resources for multiple reasons. And it's interconnected. And because we are living in such kind of capitalist world where this inequalities is way beyond our control. So it's like, again, maybe we could have one more podcast in your upcoming days to talk about it, because it's so deep. We need to understand why even till today women are not even having the leadership qualities, and then displaced women. So it's multiple layers of displacement, multiple layers of gender gap, multiple layers of discrimination. So we need to talk about the privilege, who has the privilege, who has the right, and who has the power to discuss about it. And I always say, like, if I'm sharing my story and my resilience story, but maybe sometime we don't have the audience who really want to listen to our stories. We really don't have those much a partnership who really need to work with us. That's why we become dependent to work with the UN agencies or INGOs, who sometime or multiple times just feel like we are just their data, we are just their beneficiary. And we as a refugee-led organization, women-led organization, feel we are not being get matured, get more independent to work how we really want to work. So this dependency make us more vulnerable. So as I said, this whole development sector work is need to restructure. We really need to rebuild the future we want. So really want to generate systematic change. So we feel how we are sharing the power. We really need to create a shift the power. Otherwise, we will see there are very few men who are deciding what's the future, what the new order. And we as a woman, we are just feeling, okay, again, we have this pressure, this labor on our shoulder to advocate for our inclusive rights.
Broadly, my audience who listens to this podcast and also like engage with us are students, researchers, academicians, policymakers, journalists. So, and each of them have a role to contribute. Yeah, like we are also having a role to contribute in our own way to this recent. No, it's not recent, but yeah, it's the crisis which is we are witnessing right now, the climate issue, and it's interconnected. What's the way forward, actually? So, how we can contribute in our own capacities, and how we can suggest people to be part of this kind of movement.
Well, I always say, and I will say here for your audience and for the whole audience who are listening to us, like, we really need to rethink the way we are engaging. I really want us to be aware to stop certain stuff. Like we don't need to create a competition of vulnerabilities. It's not, again, we are creating who we are saving as a more vulnerable. No, we need to understand intersectional lens. And if we are addressing to the one community or one issue, it doesn't mean other issues are get disappear or get solved. I wish, I hope, but it's not happening. There all other issues are, and it's interlinked. And we can't have gender justice without climate justice. We can't have equality and equity without reshift the power dynamic. And we can't get more inclusive policy if we are not inviting everyone with the equal power. So it's, again, maybe we really need to stop few things and really need to restart how we revisit our vision, how we are involving the community in us, not to just to listen their story, but really need to understand how we work with them as a partner.
I very much agree with you, what you just said, Anila. No, it's really about recognizing that all of these questions are interlinked, and the multiple inequalities, you outline them perfectly, are we really need to address those to really work towards a more resilient society. From a climate perspective, I think I mentioned this also in the beginning, I think it's absolutely essential that we recognize that transformation will come. Either we can steer this in a way that is socially just, that recognizes inequalities, and that also addresses the climate crisis in its multiple components, or we will be forced into a transformation through increasing social upheaval, if you will, but also obviously climate impacts that will become worse and worse and worse, and we'll get towards the very foundations of what we need in terms of food security, water security. We have a biodiversity crisis. So transformation will come either way, and we have the tools, we have the technology that obviously also plays a big role in the transformation. We have all of the opportunity that we need to really steer that transformation towards a more positive outcome. And I very much hope that all of the multilateral agreements and different initiatives, organizations, activists across levels will be able to come together to really steer the ship in a different direction, and really steer the transformation towards a positive outcome.